I'm David Skidmore. In this lesson, we're going to continue talking about double lateral strokes, but we're also going to introduce a new stroke type, the single alternating stroke. The single alternating stroke is used to play continuous alternating strokes by two mallets in the same hand. With single alternating strokes, a separate wrist turn produces each note, and each note prepares the next note. The wrist turn that you use to play single alternating strokes is very similar to the wrist turn that you use to play single independent strokes. The big difference is that you'll recall that when you're playing single independent strokes, you want to keep the mallet that's not playing as still as possible. And by contrast, with single alternating strokes, you want to use each note that you play to prepare the next note that you'll play. We're still going to be thinking about the piston type stroke that we've been talking about from the very first lesson. And the way it's incorporated with single alternating strokes is that the mallets begin above the keyboard, and then you begin your single alternating strokes. And when you're done with the single alternating strokes, the mallets go back to their resting position above the keyboard. Let's also talk about the differences between single alternating strokes and double lateral strokes. You use single alternating strokes when you've got 4 or more alternating notes by two mallets in the same hand. It's the continuous nature of the back and forth between two mallets in the same hand that tell us that we need to use single alternating strokes. On the other hand, if you have two notes played by alternating mallets in the same hand followed by a rest, you'll use a double lateral stroke. Warm-up number 1A gives us a great chance to practice the difference between single alternating strokes and double lateral strokes. Start by focusing on just 2 measures of this exercise at a time. The first 2 measures of this exercise, you'll be using single alternating strokes. The next 2 measures, you use double lateral strokes. The next 2 measures, you use single alternating strokes in your other hand. And finally, the last 2 measures, you use double lateral strokes in that other hand. By the way, don't forget to check out that key signature. You have 4 flats in the key signature for this lesson. As with all the exercises, be sure to practice this exercise at a wide range of different dynamic levels. In warm-up number 1B, you play the exact same pitch content that you're playing in warm-up number 1A. The only difference is that now you're combining your 2 hands. So although the written rhythm looks a lot different, if you pick the exercise apart, exercise 1B is essentially exactly the same as exercise 1A. You start off by playing single alternating strokes in both hands. Then in the second part of the exercise, you play double lateral strokes in both hands. You should feel free to practice the exercise in the exact way that I was just demonstrating it. Both hands together and then one hand at a time. Going back and forth like that will really help you focus on the stroke type that you're using in your individual hands and how to get comfortable playing the two hands at the same time. These two exercises that we've just talked about cover all of the different stroke types that you need for the etude that's a part of this lesson. As you're learning the etude, you'll notice that the first half of the etude, you're playing entirely single alternating strokes. And in the second half of the etude, you actually play the exact same pitches, the exact same notes that you played in the first half, but now you're playing double lateral strokes instead of single alternating strokes. I also want to pause for just a moment and talk about why I call the exercises in this book warm-up exercises. Warming up before you play is a really important part of being a musician. You use muscles when you play music the same way an athlete uses muscles when they practice or compete. An athlete always warms up before they practice or compete, and by the same token, musicians should always warm up before we practice or perform. I like to use warm-ups that focus on the music that I'm going to be playing on any given day. That's why all of the warm-up exercises in my book contain notes from the etudes that we have to learn anyway. They focus on the techniques that we're talking about in each given lesson, and they focus on maybe the most important thing, which is just getting our muscles going so that we're ready for a nice long practice session. So keep using these warm-up exercises as you begin to get comfortable with single alternating strokes and as you continue getting even more comfortable with double lateral strokes. The next thing that we're going to talk about is interval changes. Your right hand changes intervals more frequently in this lesson than in any other lesson in this series so far. However, your left hand stays in a perfect fifth throughout the entire lesson. This means that we can spend all of our energy focusing on interval changes in our right hand. Let's take a look at warm-up number 2A. This exercise gives you a chance to practice all of the interval changes that you'll need to play the etude that's a part of this lesson. Let's review interval changes using each of our different grips. If you're using Stephen's grip, remember that you roll the inside mallet between your thumb and first finger. Now, one common tendency with Stephen's grip is for tension to start to creep into your hand as your intervals get wider. A great way to avoid this tension is by periodically resetting the contact point between your thumb and your first finger. So if I started a more narrow interval like this, I might get to a medium interval and then reset the contact point between my thumb and first finger before stretching out to a wider interval. By resetting the contact point between my thumb and first finger, it allows my hands to stay more relaxed as I'm playing. And it doesn't impact how quickly I can change intervals either. With the Burton grip, remember that to make the interval wider, you pull the inside mallet away from your body with your pinky, ring, and middle finger. And to make the interval more narrow, you push that inside mallet towards your body with those same fingers. Also notice how with the Burton grip, as you get to a more narrow interval, your first finger comes out from in between your two mallets. And as the interval gets wider and wider, that first finger curls under your hand. And finally, let's talk about interval changes with traditional grip. To change intervals with traditional grip, use your thumb and first finger to push outward. That'll make the interval wider. And then your pinky, ring, and middle finger can push the mallets closer together to make the interval more narrow. Now let's try warm-up number 2A. Remember that your left hand is staying at a perfect fifth so that we can focus all of our energy on the interval changes happening in our right hand. When you've spent some time on exercise number 2A, move on to exercise number 2B, which uses the exact same pitch content, the same notes, but in a pattern that reflects the music that you'll be learning in the Etude. The phrasing exercise in this lesson gives you a couple of ideas of how to phrase the first 4 measures of the Etude. You'll notice in the phrasing exercise and throughout the Etude, tenuto markings, those little dashes over certain notes. A tenuto marking is like an accent, only it's not emphasized as much as an accent. So if you see a note with a tenuto marking, it is emphasized, but if you see a note with an accent marking, it's emphasized more than a note with a tenuto marking. Another way to think of tenuto markings is thinking about a little bit of weight on the note. So sometimes I'll imagine that when I'm playing a note with a tenuto marking over it, it's as though my mallet has suddenly become twice as heavy as it was for the notes without tenuto markings. Tenuto markings, like accents, are relative to the printed dynamic. So, for instance, a tenuto marking over a passage of music marked mezzo forte is going to be louder than a tenuto marking in a passage of music marked piano. Tenuto markings and accent markings also have to be put in the context of the musical phrase that you're playing. This means that not all tenuto markings in this piece are going to be exactly the same volume level. So you might have a passage that's marked mezzo forte with a bunch of tenuto markings, but the same way that you create variations in how loud or quiet the unaccented notes are, you also create variations in how loud or quiet the tenuto marking notes are. This might sound like a lot to think about, and it is, but it just takes practice. So start nice and slow. When you first start thinking about tenuto markings or accent markings within the context of a musical phrase, it requires a lot of concentration because you're really trying to make sure that every note is exactly the right volume level. But the more time you spend doing this, the more it becomes second nature. So don't worry if in this lesson you never get to the point where you're really comfortable playing tenutos in the context of a musical phrase, because we'll spend plenty more time talking about this throughout this lesson series. Thanks for watching. And also be sure to watch my performance of the complete Etude from this lesson. See you next time.